The conference hall aboard the Nexus station hummed with activity. Representatives from various species filled the air with chatter, their distinct voices blending into a chaotic symphony. At the center of it all sat the humans, their delegation modest but determined. Among them was Captain Jonathan Carter, a quiet but observant man, his sharp brown eyes taking in every detail of the room. This was no ordinary diplomatic meeting. The Valkyries, a race both feared and revered, had agreed to attend. Known for their unmatched combat prowess and their striking appearance, the Valkyries had earned a reputation as a warrior race that held outsiders at arm's length. Few had ever seen them, let alone spoken to them. Jonathan had read the reports, but nothing could have prepared him for their entrance. The room fell silent as the doors slid open. A group of Valkyries warriors strode in with precision, their armor gleaming under the station's lights. They were tall, their movements graceful yet deliberate, and their piercing silver eyes scanned the room like predators assessing prey. At their head was Commander Aaron Thiller, a figure of commanding presence. Her sharp features, framed by dark, braided hair, exuded authority. Jonathan watched as she approached the central table. Despite her stern demeanor, there was a quiet tension in her posture, as if she carried the weight of her people's expectations. The humans rose to greet her, led by Ambassador Quan, whose carefully rehearsed words of welcome echoed in the room. "Commander Thiller, we are honored by your presence," Quan began, bowing slightly. Aaron inclined her head in acknowledgement, but said nothing, her expression unreadable. Her silence stretched for a moment before she spoke, her voice sharp and measured. "We are not here for pleasantries. If humanity seeks an alliance, you will prove your worth." The Valkyries warriors murmured their approval. Their culture valued strength and action above all else, and Aaron's bluntness was a reflection of that. Jonathan noticed the uneasy glances exchanged by his colleagues. Ambassador Quan, however, maintained his composure. "We understand, Commander. Humanity is prepared to demonstrate its capabilities. Cooperation between our peoples could benefit us all." Aaron's eyes narrowed slightly. "Words are easy. Actions reveal truth. We will judge for ourselves." As the formalities continued, Jonathan remained silent, observing. The Valkyries were clearly sizing up the humans, their gazes sharp and unyielding. Yet beneath their stoic exteriors, he sensed something more: curiosity, perhaps even caution. When the meeting concluded, Aaron and her delegation retreated to their designated quarters, leaving the humans to discuss the next steps. The room buzzed with tension. "That was intense," one of the younger officers muttered, running a hand through his hair. "They're testing us," Quan said, his tone thoughtful. "We'll need to show them something extraordinary to gain their trust." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The Valkyries were formidable, but their guarded demeanor hinted at something deeper. Why had they agreed to this meeting at all if they were so distrustful? Later that evening, Jonathan found himself wandering the observation deck of the station. The vastness of space stretched before him, dotted with stars and distant planets. It was a rare moment of quiet reflection. He was startled by a voice behind him. "You are different from the others." Turning, he found himself face to face with Commander Aaron. She stood tall and imposing, yet there was an unexpected softness in her gaze. "I didn't mean to intrude," Jonathan said, his voice calm. "Just needed a moment to think." Aaron studied him for a moment before stepping closer. "Most humans would not approach me so casually. They either fear us or try too hard to impress us." Jonathan offered a small smile. "I'm not here to impress anyone. I'm here to understand." Her brow furrowed slightly, as if his response surprised her. "Understand what?" "Your people," he said simply. "Why you value strength so much. What you've been through to make you this way." Aaron's eyes flickered with something he couldn't quite place. Respect, perhaps. She crossed her arms, her tone softening slightly. "We have endured much. Trust does not come easily to us." Jonathan nodded. "I get that. Trust isn't given. It's earned. For a moment, silence hung between them. Then, to his surprise, Aaron gave a small nod. You speak wisely for someone who does not know us. As she turned to leave, Jonathan couldn't help but feel that something had shifted. The Valkyries were not invulnerable, nor were they as unapproachable as they seemed. As he watched her disappear down the corridor, he resolved to find a way to bridge the gap between their peoples. After all, humanity's strength wasn't just in its technology or strategy. It was in its ability to connect, even with the most unlikely of allies. The next morning, the atmosphere at the Nexus station was tense. The Valkyries had made it clear that they would only consider an alliance if humanity could prove its strength. For the past several days, the humans had been attending meetings and discussing possible trade deals and diplomatic agreements. But it was now time to show what humanity was truly capable of. Commander Aaron Thiller stood at the front of the room, her gaze sharp and unwavering. Behind her, a group of Valkyries warriors, each one more intimidating than the last, stood silently. They were all skilled fighters, their presence alone enough to make most species tremble in fear. Their reputation as warriors was unmatched, and today they would test humanity's resolve. Ambassador Quan stepped forward, his voice firm but respectful. We understand the importance of proving our strength, Commander. We are prepared to participate in the trials you've set forth. Aaron nodded, her expression unreadable. These trials are not for the faint of heart. If you wish to earn our respect, you must demonstrate your worth on the battlefield. Only the strong are worthy of our trust. A murmur ran through the room. The humans had not expected this. They had known the Valkyries were fierce, but no one had anticipated such an immediate and intense challenge. It was clear that Aaron's people didn't see diplomacy as the way to earn an alliance. They valued action, strength, and courage above all else. Jonathan Carter stood at the back of the room, observing the unfolding scene. He had never been a warrior in the traditional sense. His role had always been that of a diplomat, using words in negotiations to resolve conflicts. But something about Aaron's words struck him deeply. The Valkyries were offering them a chance to prove their worth, not through talk, but through action. Captain Carter, Quan called out, turning to face him. You've been quiet. Do you think we're ready for this challenge? Jonathan paused for a moment, his mind working quickly. The human delegation wasn't prepared for a full combat trial. Their soldiers were trained, of course, but the Valkyries were on a different level altogether. Yet, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that this was an opportunity to show the Valkyries that humanity had something more to offer than just weapons. I'll participate, Jonathan said finally, his voice steady. The room fell silent. Everyone turned to look at him, surprised by his decision. He was a diplomat, not a soldier. He had never seen combat in the way the Valkyries fought. But Jonathan had always believed in the power of understanding, of thinking outside the box. If he could use his intelligence and his ability to adapt, perhaps he could show the Valkyries a different kind of strength, one that didn't rely solely on physical prowess. Aaron's eyes flickered toward him, a trace of curiosity crossing her face. You? She asked, her voice cold but intrigued. You are not a warrior. Jonathan met her gaze without hesitation. I am not a warrior, but I am willing to fight for what matters. I will prove that there is more to strength than just force. Aaron studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Then, without a word, she motioned for him to follow. The training arena was massive, designed to test the abilities of even the most seasoned fighters. As Jonathan entered, he was struck by the sight of the Valkyries warriors preparing for their own training session. They moved with a fluidity and grace that could only come from years of combat experience. It was clear that their strength was not just physical, but deeply ingrained in their culture and mindset. Jonathan stepped onto the field, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure what kind of test awaited him, but he knew he couldn't back down now. Aaron stood beside him, her arms crossed. You will fight against one of my best warriors. If you survive, we will consider you worthy of further trials. Jonathan nodded, trying to steady his breathing. He wasn't sure what the Valkyrus expected from him, but he was determined to give his best. His mind raced as he thought about his strategy. The Valkyrus valued strength and honor, but he had learned in his years as a diplomat that sometimes the greatest strength lay in the ability to outthink your opponent. The door to the arena opened, and a Valkyrus warrior stepped forward. She was tall, with striking silver eyes and dark hair tied back in a warrior's braid. Her presence was intimidating, and her gaze seemed to pierce right through Jonathan. "Your name?" Jonathan asked, trying to maintain his composure. "Vera," she replied, her voice cold and firm. Without further warning, Vera lunged at Jonathan, her movements swift and precise. Jonathan barely had time to react as she came at him with a series of rapid strikes. He ducked and dodged, using his agility to avoid her attacks. The crowd of Valkyrus warriors watched intently, their eyes never leaving the fight. Jonathan's mind raced. He knew he couldn't match Vera's speed and strength, but he could outmaneuver her. As she swung again, he dropped to the ground, sliding under her and using her own momentum to knock her off balance. The Valkyrus warriors gasped in surprise. Vera quickly regained her stance, her eyes narrowing with newfound respect. Jonathan didn't wait for her to recover. He moved quickly, using his surroundings to his advantage. He grabbed a training staff from the side of the arena and deflected her next strike. Erin watched closely, her expression unreadable. Jonathan wasn't winning, but he was proving something. He wasn't relying on brute force. He was using his mind, his ability to adapt, and his willingness to think differently. Finally, after a long exchange, Vera stepped back, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. She nodded to Jonathan, acknowledging his efforts. "Not bad for a human," she said, a hint of admiration in her voice. Jonathan stood tall, a smile tugging at his lips. "Not bad for anyone," he replied, his voice filled with quiet confidence. Erin approached him, her gaze softening slightly. "You may not be a warrior, Captain Carter, but you have shown us something we did not expect." Jonathan nodded, the weight of the moment sinking in. He hadn't won the battle, but he had earned something far more valuable: respect. The days following Jonathan's trial in the arena were filled with tense anticipation. The Valkyrus warriors had seen him fight, and while they had not expected him to win, they were impressed by his ability to think strategically. In their eyes, strength wasn't just about how hard you could hit or how fast you could move. It was about how well you could adapt to the unexpected. Jonathan felt the weight of this realization as he walked through the halls of the Nexus station. The Valkyrus had not given him their full approval, but they had shown respect, and that was a start. He could see it in their eyes. Something had shifted. The next step would be even harder. As he approached the main conference room, Ambassador Quan met him at the door. "You did well in the arena," Quan said, his voice low. "But we're not out of the woods yet. The Valkyrus are watching closely. They want more." Jonathan nodded. "I know. We've earned some respect, but it's just the beginning. I'll have to do more if we want to prove we're worthy allies." Quan's expression was serious. "I've heard word of another challenge. This time, it will be more than just a test of physical combat. The Valkyrus want to see our ability to cooperate and work as a team." Jonathan's brow furrowed. He had proven himself as an individual, but teamwork was another challenge altogether. The human delegation wasn't built for combat in the way the Valkyrus were. Most of them were diplomats, engineers, and scientists. How could they possibly match the Valkyrus in terms of strength and unity? "You're asking for a miracle, Quan," Jonathan said, the weight of the situation sinking in. "Our people aren't warriors." "We don't need warriors," Quan replied. "We need to show the Valkyrus that humanity's strength lies not just in fighting, but in our ability to work together under pressure." Jonathan took a deep breath. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was possible. He had seen the strength of the human spirit in action before. They may not have the same kind of battle-hardened warriors as the Valkyrus, But they had something else: their creativity, their ability to adapt, and their willingness to cooperate for a common goal. That evening, the human delegation gathered in the station's training hall. The room was buzzing with nerves, but there was also a sense of determination. They had no choice but to succeed. Jonathan stood at the front, addressing the group. "Listen up, everyone," he began. "The Valkyries are watching us closely. They want to see if we can work together as a team. We're not here to fight them in the way they fight. We're here to show them that humanity's strength lies in our unity and adaptability." One of the engineers, Lieutenant Davis, spoke up. "But how can we even compete? The Valkyries have centuries of combat experience. What do we have?" Jonathan's gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of every person present. "We have each other. We have the ability to think outside the box, to innovate. They don't know how to fight like us, and that's our advantage. We just need to use it." The team nodded in agreement. Jonathan could see the spark of determination in their eyes. They may not be warriors, but they were resilient, and they had each other. That was their strength. The next day, the challenge began. Erin Thaler stood at the head of the training hall, her arms crossed and her piercing eyes watching the human delegation carefully. Behind her, the Valkyrus warriors were silent, observing everything that took place. "Today," Erin began, her voice cold but not unkind, "you will face a series of trials designed to test your ability to cooperate under pressure. This is not about individual glory. This is about teamwork." Jonathan's heart raced as he looked at the team behind him. There was no turning back now. The first trial was a simulated mission. The human team was tasked with infiltrating a simulated enemy base, retrieving vital information, and escaping without being detected. They had to work together, coordinating every movement. Failure wasn't an option. Jonathan took the lead, guiding his team through the mission with careful precision. Lieutenant Davis used his engineering skills to disable security systems, while Commander Stevens, a former military officer, guided the team through the enemy base, using his experience to anticipate every move. The rest of the team worked together to cover each other's backs, communicating quietly and efficiently. They moved swiftly, the tension building as they neared their objective. Jonathan could feel the weight of the Valkyries watching them, their eyes assessing every action. This was more than just a simulation. It was a test of everything they had worked for. Finally, they reached the objective, an encrypted data terminal. Lieutenant Davis quickly accessed it, while the rest of the team stood guard, ensuring they weren't detected. Time was running out, and the pressure was mounting. Jonathan's mind raced as he scanned the room, looking for any potential threats. With the mission accomplished, they made their way back to the extraction point. It was a close call, but they succeeded. As the simulation ended, Erin stepped forward, her expression neutral but her eyes gleaming with something like respect. "You have proven that humanity is capable of working together under pressure," she said. "But there is one final trial." Jonathan felt a knot form in his stomach. He had hoped that would be the end of it, but it seemed the Valkyries were far from satisfied. Erin's voice was firm as she looked at the team. "The final trial will test your ability to adapt and survive in the harshest conditions. You will be sent to a planet known for its extreme environments. There you will have to rely on each other to survive." Jonathan exchanged a look with his team. The Valkyries weren't making this easy, but they had come this far. The final trial awaited, and they would face it together. The team had only a few hours to prepare for the final trial. The moment Erin's words sank in, Jonathan felt the pressure intensify. The Valkyries were not going to make things easy for them, but as daunting as it was, he knew this would be the ultimate test, a chance to prove to the Valkyries that humanity could thrive, even in the most difficult of circumstances. They gathered in the briefing room, the atmosphere heavy with uncertainty. Quan, the human ambassador, stood at the front, his expression serious. "This will not be an easy mission. The planet we're heading to is one of the most extreme environments known to us. The Valkyries want to see how we perform when pushed to our limits. Jonathan glanced at his team. Most of them were scientists, diplomats, and engineers, not trained survivalists. Yet each of them had proven themselves capable in different ways throughout the past trials. Their determination was their greatest asset. "This is about survival," Jonathan said, addressing his team. "We've trained for this. We may not be warriors, but we are capable of working together. That's our strength. Trust in each other, and we'll make it through." His words seemed to lift their spirits, and a few exchanged nods of agreement. They had already overcome so much together. Now, they needed to face the unknown. The team boarded the transport ship that would take them to the harsh planet. As they ascended into the atmosphere, Jonathan couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. The planet they were heading to was known for its extreme temperatures, unpredictable storms, and dangerous wildlife. It was a place where few had ever survived without expert knowledge of its terrain. But the Valkyries weren't looking for experts. They were looking for humans who could adapt, think on their feet, and support each other. The transport ship touched down on the planet's surface with a heavy thud. The doors opened, revealing the barren landscape before them. Red rocks stretched out as far as the eye could see, and the air was thick with dust. The sun hummed low in the sky, casting an orange hue over everything. Jonathan stepped out, feeling the harsh winds immediately whip at his face. The temperature was sweltering, the heat radiating off the ground beneath them. He glanced back at his team. They were all suited up in specialized environmental gear, but it didn't make the conditions any easier to bear. "We've got a small window to complete the trial," Quan said, his voice steady but tinged with concern. "We have to find shelter before the temperature reaches unbearable levels. The planet's storms are unpredictable, and they can hit without warning." Jonathan nodded, turning to lead his team. The first priority was to find shelter, but that was easier said than done. They had to navigate through rocky terrain, where every step seemed like a challenge. There was little to no vegetation in sight, only dry, cracked earth and scattered boulders. The heat was oppressive, and every breath felt like it burned his lungs. They pushed on, working as a unit. Lieutenant Davis, the engineer, had a small device that could help detect shifts in the weather, and he was keeping a close watch on it. "There's a storm coming," he warned. "We need to find shelter, and fast." The urgency in his voice pushed the team to move even faster. Jonathan's mind raced as he scanned the area for any sign of cover. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, but he knew they had to keep moving. A storm would make the conditions even worse, and they couldn't afford to waste time. As they climbed a narrow pass between two cliffs, Jonathan's heart skipped a beat when he spotted a cave entrance just ahead. "There," he called out. "We've got shelter." They sprinted toward the cave, their hearts pounding in their chests. Just as they reached the entrance, the first gusts of the storm slammed into them, sending dust and debris swirling through the air. Jonathan pulled his team inside, and they huddled together, grateful for the brief respite. The cave was small but deep enough to offer protection from the storm outside. They set up camp quickly, using their limited resources to make themselves as comfortable as possible. Lieutenant Davis and Commander Stevens worked on securing the entrance, while the others set up their gear. The storm raged outside, its fury hammering against the cave walls. For a while, there was nothing but the sound of the storm. Jonathan couldn't help but think about how close they had come to failure. The harsh conditions of the planet were a stark reminder of just how vulnerable they were, but they had survived, together. As the hours passed, the storm subsided, but the temperature didn't improve. They still had to make their way to the extraction point, a location marked on their map by the Valkyries. The distance was far, and the harsh conditions would only get worse. But Jonathan knew that this was their only chance to prove they could overcome any obstacle. In the quiet of the cave, Jonathan gathered his team once more. "We've made it this far, but the hardest part is still ahead of us," he said. "We need to stick together, stay focused, and keep moving forward." The Valkyries are watching us, and we can't afford to fail. The team nodded, their resolve strengthening. They were no longer just fighting for their survival. They were fighting for humanity's place among the stars. Together, they could face anything. As the team prepared to leave the shelter, Jonathan looked out into the desolate landscape. The road ahead would be difficult, but he had no doubt that humanity would prove itself, not with strength alone, but with the power of unity and determination. They were ready. The storm had passed, but the planet's unforgiving environment remained. The temperature had dropped slightly, but the air was still thick with dust, and the rocky terrain showed no mercy. Jonathan could feel the pressure of the Valkyries' expectations bearing down on them. Every step forward was a battle, and they could not afford to make any mistakes. They packed up quickly, taking only the essentials, knowing that they still had a long way to go. The extraction point was located on the other side of a vast, barren valley, miles of jagged rocks and uneven ground. If they didn't move fast, the temperature would rise again, and the risks would grow. "Stay sharp, everyone," Jonathan said as he looked at his team. "We've come this far, but we still have a long way to go. Keep your focus." They nodded in agreement, their faces determined. Despite the hardships, Jonathan could see that they were stronger now. The trials had brought them closer, turning them into a unit that depended on each other, each person contributing their strengths. And while they may not have been born to fight, they had learned how to work together like never before. They began the trek across the valley, moving carefully to avoid the sharp rocks that seemed to spring up from the ground unexpectedly. The air was dry and oppressive, and Jonathan could feel the weight of the journey pulling at his body. But they could not stop. Not now. Lieutenant Davis, always the optimist, kept checking his equipment and scanning the horizon. "We're about halfway there," he called out after an hour. But the storms shifted the terrain. "It's going to be harder to navigate from here." Jonathan looked at the rough landscape ahead. It was true. The valley had become even more treacherous. The occasional rockslide had disrupted their path, and some of the narrow gaps between the cliffs were now blocked off by piles of rubble. There was no easy way forward. "We'll have to move around it," Jonathan said, his voice firm but calm. "Keep your distance from the edges. If there's another slide, we'll want to be as safe as possible." The team adjusted their course, making their way through the shifting landscape. The day wore on, and exhaustion began to creep in. Jonathan's legs felt heavy, and his throat was dry from the constant dust in the air. But he couldn't let himself show any weakness. He was the leader, and his team depended on him. Hours passed, and by the time they reached a small outcrop of rock to take shelter, the sun was setting. The orange hue of the sky made the valley look even more inhospitable, the long shadows stretching out like the fingers of some giant monster. "We can rest here for the night," Jonathan said, his voice tired but steady. "We've made good progress. Tomorrow, we push for the extraction point." The team nodded, but no one made a move to sit. They all knew the journey wasn't over yet. They could rest, but only briefly. The Valkyries had set this challenge with no sympathy, and they had to be ready for anything. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. The chill cut through their suits, but the team had gotten used to the discomfort by now. They huddled together, sharing what little food they had left, the atmosphere tense but hopeful. They were closer than ever to completing the trial. Lieutenant Davis, who had kept quiet most of the day, spoke up. "Jonathan," he said, his voice thoughtful, "I've been thinking. We're not going to make it if we don't do something about the heat. It's going to get worse as we move on, and we can't keep up at this pace." Jonathan looked at him, intrigued. "What do you suggest?" "I've got a portable heat shield in my pack. It's not much, but if we can deploy it in the right spots, it'll help us deflect some of the sun's rays and lower the temperature as we move," Davis explained. Jonathan thought for a moment. It was risky. There was no guarantee the shield would work in such extreme conditions, but it was their only option. Without it, they'd have to struggle through the heat, and that would only slow them down. "Do it," Jonathan said, making the decision. "We can't afford to take chances." Davis quickly set to work, deploying the heat shield in the direction of the valley where the sun would rise. It wasn't perfect, but it would help. Jonathan watched as the shield adjusted and began to glow faintly, reflecting some of the intense sunlight away from the valley floor. The team settled down for the night, but sleep didn't come easily. Jonathan lay awake, staring up at the rock ceiling. The pressure of the trial, the Valkyrie's expectations, and the responsibility he carried weighed heavily on his mind. But he knew they were on the right path. They had come this far together. There was no turning back now. The next morning, they resumed their journey, and the heat shield worked as hoped, making the trek a bit more manageable. With each step, they grew closer to the extraction point. The valley stretched out before them, barren and silent, but now they knew they could handle whatever came their way. As the day wore on, the exhaustion was beginning to show on their faces, but there was no time to stop now. They could see the extraction point in the distance, a small, outpost-like structure that marked the end of the trial. Jonathan's heart raced. They were so close. But then, a sudden shift in the air caught his attention. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and a loud cracking sound echoed through the valley. "Get down," Jonathan shouted, instinctively pushing his team to the ground. A rock slide had started, and it was heading straight toward them. They had no time to react. The only thing they could do was brace for impact. The ground shook violently, and the air was filled with a deafening roar as the rock slide came crashing down. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest as the massive boulders and debris hurtled toward them. There was no time to think, only to act. He grabbed Lieutenant Davis by the arm and yanked him out of the path of a falling rock. "Everyone, move," Jonathan shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Get to higher ground now." The team scrambled to their feet, their movements desperate as they tried to outrun the avalanche of rocks. Jonathan's eyes scanned the valley for a safe place to take cover. The rock slide seemed endless, and the debris filled the air with a choking dust. The whole valley looked as if it was coming apart at the seams. Jonathan pushed himself forward, his legs burning from exhaustion, but he couldn't stop. The rocks continued to fall, and the team was scattered in different directions. He had to make sure they all made it out alive. He reached for his comms device. "Quan, do you copy? We need extraction, now. The rock slide is too much." There was a crackle of static, and then Quan's voice came through, calm but urgent. "Jonathan, we're on our way. Hold on." But Jonathan knew they wouldn't be able to hold on forever. They needed to keep moving. He turned to see the others. Davis, Stevens, and the others were already climbing up the side of a steep rock formation, trying to escape the descending debris. He took a deep breath and followed them, his mind racing as he pushed past the fear and exhaustion. The dust cloud from the rock slide was thickening, and visibility was rapidly diminishing. Jonathan could barely see his hand in front of his face as he climbed higher, using every ounce of strength to push himself forward. The temperature had risen again, and his suit felt heavier with each step. He reached the top of the rock formation, just as another wave of debris thundered down, narrowly missing him. He looked down to see Davis, still struggling to climb, his hands slipping on the loose rocks. Jonathan didn't hesitate. He extended his hand to help him up. "Come on, Davis. Grab my hand," Jonathan shouted. With a strained grunt, Davis managed to catch his breath and grasp Jonathan's hand. Jonathan pulled him up, and together, they stumbled to a flat ledge where the rest of the team had already gathered. But they couldn't rest. Not yet. The threat of the rock slide was still present. They had to keep moving. "Is everyone here?" Jonathan asked, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. "All accounted for," Stevens replied, looking around to make sure no one had been left behind. "Good. Now we need to get to the extraction point as fast as we can," Jonathan said, not wasting any time. They all nodded and started moving again. The perilous journey not over yet. Every step felt like a challenge. They had barely escaped the rock slide, but now they faced the harsh valley ahead of them. The ground was uneven, and the air was still thick with dust. It was a race against time, and Jonathan knew they couldn't afford another delay. As they pushed forward, Jonathan's thoughts kept drifting to the Valkyries. They had been watching every move, every step of this journey. He could only imagine how they were evaluating their every decision. Would they see the team as worthy of success, or would the dangers of the planet be too much for them? "Jonathan," Davis called from behind. "We're not far from the extraction point, but we need to be careful. The storm's shifting again. I'm picking up a surge of electrical activity in the atmosphere." Jonathan glanced up at the sky. The clouds were darkening, swirling in ominous patterns. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The planet had already proven to be unforgiving, but now it was going to test them in new ways. "We need shelter," Jonathan said, urgency creeping into his voice. "Get to the extraction point as fast as possible, but stay alert. We don't know what's coming." As they pressed on, the wind picked up, howling through the valley. Jonathan gritted his teeth against the increasing gusts, trying to keep his focus on the path ahead. The last stretch of the journey was in sight, but the weather was turning against them. Without warning, a bolt of lightning struck the ground just a few meters away from them. The team jumped back, the electric shock of the strike sending a jolt through their bodies. Jonathan could feel the heat from the lightning, even through his suit. "This is bad," Stevens said, looking around with wide eyes. "We need cover now." "Move," Jonathan ordered, motioning for them to get behind a rock outcrop. They scrambled to the shelter, just as another bolt of lightning lit up the sky. The storm was intensifying, and Jonathan's mind raced. The Valkyries had pushed them to the limits of survival, but they had shown no mercy. The planet's trials were relentless, and every step felt like it could be their last. But they had made it this far. They couldn't stop now. "We'll wait out the storm here," Jonathan said, his voice grim. "We're too close to give up. The extraction point is just ahead. We have to stay alive a little longer." The team huddled together, the storm swirling outside. They had survived the rock slide, the heat, and the uncertainty. But now, with the storm at its peak, Jonathan could feel the weight of their journey pressing down on them. They were at the edge of the trial. One final push, and they would make it. But would they? The question lingered in Jonathan's mind as he stared out into the storm, his thoughts a mix of hope and fear. They couldn't afford to fail. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. "Stay strong," he whispered to himself, clenching his fists. "We can do this." The storm raged outside the rocky shelter, howling winds and flashes of lightning, making the atmosphere feel like an impenetrable force. Inside, the team huddled together, exhausted but determined to see this through. They had come so far. Jonathan could feel the weight of the challenge on his shoulders, but there was no turning back. The Valkyries were watching, their eyes focused on every decision the humans made. They had survived the rock slide, the heat, the relentless terrain of the planet. Now, the final test loomed ahead. The extraction point was just within reach, but the storm was a reminder of how unforgiving this world could be. Jonathan scanned the horizon through the narrow opening in the shelter. The wind had intensified, and the sky was filled with swirling clouds, making it almost impossible to see anything clearly. He had expected difficulties, but this was worse than he had imagined. "Davis," Jonathan called, his voice steady despite the chaos outside. "Check the comms again. We need confirmation of the extraction location. The storm is messing with the signals." Davis nodded and crouched down, fiddling with the comms device. The static was overwhelming, making it difficult to hear anything clearly. Jonathan's patience was thinning, but he couldn't afford to show it. Not now. A few tense minutes passed before Davis finally spoke. "I got it. The extraction point is close, just another few kilometers through the storm. Jonathan exhaled, relief flooding his chest for a brief moment. They were so close. "All right, everyone. It's time to move," Jonathan said, his voice calm but firm. "We've made it this far. We're not stopping now." The team gathered their gear and prepared to make the final push. The storm had become more than just a challenge. It was a test of their resolve. Every step they took would be against the full force of nature, but there was no other choice. They had to reach the extraction point. Jonathan led the way, pushing forward through the storm. The winds whipped against their faces, and the rain felt like cold needles on their skin. It was hard to keep their footing on the slick, muddy ground. Every step felt like it took twice the effort. But they didn't stop. As they moved through the storm, Jonathan couldn't help but think about everything they had faced. The relentless trials of the planet had tested their limits, but they had proven their strength. He thought about the Valkyries, who had thrown these challenges their way. What would they think of the humans now? Would they see the determination, the resilience, and the ingenuity that had carried them this far? The storm seemed endless. Each gust of wind tried to push them back, but Jonathan's focus remained unshaken. The extraction point was close. They just had to hold on a little longer. "We can do this," Jonathan muttered to himself, as much to reassure his own nerves as to motivate the others. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the edge of the valley. The storm began to die down, the winds easing just enough for them to see the faint outline of the extraction vehicle in the distance. It was their salvation, a promise that the long journey was almost over. "We made it," Stevens yelled, his voice breaking the tense silence. His face was soaked with rain, but there was a smile on his lips. Jonathan's heart leaped in his chest. They had done it. They had survived the harshest tests, and now the extraction was finally within their grasp. "Keep moving," Jonathan urged, his eyes fixed on the vehicle. "We're almost there. Don't stop now." The team pushed forward, their steps growing quicker as they neared the extraction vehicle. The storm had passed, and the clouds began to clear, revealing the first hints of daylight. They were no longer trapped in the relentless darkness. As they reached the extraction point, the Valkyrie's vessel appeared overhead, a large ship descending slowly. The shimmering blue light from the ship illuminated the area, casting a calming glow over the team. The moment they had been waiting for was finally here. The ship's doors opened, and the team began to board, one by one. Jonathan turned to look back at the planet, a sense of pride swelling within him. They had proven themselves. They had faced down the odds and triumphed. He felt a deep sense of accomplishment, knowing they had made it to the end. As the team climbed aboard the ship, Jonathan shared a brief look with Lieutenant Davis. Both of them knew that this mission, this trial, was far more than just a test of strength. It had been a test of everything that made humanity unique: its creativity, its courage, and its unwavering spirit. Once everyone was safely aboard, the ship's engines powered up, and they began to ascend into the sky. The planet, with all its challenges and dangers, faded away beneath them. Jonathan took a moment to look out the window, reflecting on the journey. They had been pushed to the edge, tested like never before, but they had never given up. And as the stars stretched out before them, Jonathan couldn't help but think, this was just the beginning. They had proven to the Valkyries, and to themselves, that humanity was a force to be reckoned with. In the end, it wasn't just about surviving the planet's trials. It was about showing that no matter what the universe threw at them, humans would always find a way to persevere. The journey was over, but the legacy of what they had achieved, that would last forever.